Hello, everybody. This is the first video lecture for English 3785 for our asynchronous class on week 1. And today we're going to be talking about the graphic history titled Queer. And today we're focusing especially on pages 1 through 62. And we kind of start off here with the stated intention of the authors of this book. They ask us to think queerly, right? And they give us some really important history and background on the term queer. We learned that queer didn't always refer to sexual and gender minorities, but that in the past it connoted strangeness, and that it hasn't been until really the 20th and 21st centuries that queer comes to be first, in the first instance, a pejorative term used against LGBTQ plus people, and then in consequence to that, LGBTQ people, many LGBTQ people rehabilitate the term, right, and use it as a way to identify. As Barker mentions in our graphic history here, it's also used as an umbrella term to encompass LGBTQ plus people. Now, one thing that I would caution you against is to use this term fast and loose. It's one thing if you identify as a queer person, right? But if you don't, let's say you are a straight ally, I would say be reticent to throw that term around, be reticent to call somebody that, unless they tell you that that's what they want to be called, right? For a lot of older people, queer could be a term that was used against them and that has hurtful memories, right? So I think it's really become something that in recent years, especially younger people have come to use this term as a way to self-identify. And also, you know, queerness, as Barker points out, is something that seeks to change the system, right? One question that we are grappling with in LGBTQ plus communities is the question of whether we are assimilationist or revolutionary, right? We now have same-sex marriage, which is fantastic, but some queers would argue that this is assimilationist, right? And that it doesn't ultimately change the system. And I think that this binary between assimilationist and revolutionary is maybe a false one, right? Maybe we can think about times when we are queer and times when we are not queer or assimilationist. So what are some of the key assumptions that queer theory asks us to rethink? And if you go to page 28 of the graphic history, you will see these laid out for you. The first assumption that queer theory, and queer theory, by the way, is a study of thought that goes back to the 1980s or so. But some of the key assumptions that it asks us to rethink are, first, that identities are fixed and essential, right? So that identities like gayness or being a lesbian or being trans, that these are unchanging, that we're born that way, and that it has a stable, fixed meaning, right? So queer theory wants us to think outside of those terms, to think more complexly about how gender and sexuality operate. The other thing that it asks us to do is to rethink the idea that sexuality and gender are binary. So for instance, you know, you're either gay or you're straight. You're either a man or you're a woman. Queer theory asks us to blur the distinctions between these binaries, which aren't complex enough to contend with the diversity of bodies and desires of our society. One thing that I'm pointing out here that always kind of I struggle with at Marquette, right, is the line "men and women for others." I'm sure you've heard that before at Marquette. Men and women assumes a binary. So queer theory would ask us to complicate that binary, and maybe we could say people for others, right? That binary thinking about sex and gender just aren't adequate. The third assumption that queer theory asks us to rethink is that normal and abnormal sex can usefully be distinguished, right? So there are things, forms of sexual desire that might be codified as kink, for instance. We can't necessarily just disparage that and say there's useful procreative heterosexual sex and then there's the perversity of everything else, right? Queer theory wants us to kind of flatten the line and say, okay, whatever is sexual that isn't harming somebody and that enhances our sense of well-being and pleasure, right, is inherently a good thing. So queer theory asks us to rethink these assumptions that are, I would say, at the core of many of our social norms. Queer theory also allows us to resist the categorization of people, right? So that I, as a gay man, I sometimes identify as gay and I sometimes identify as queer. And I think that I like to move between those poles because it allows me to escape the stereotyping and the containment of these categories. Everybody is different, of course, right? Queer theory also asks us to challenge the idea of essential identities and to question binaries. So all of this is what is at the core of thinking queerly. And I'm hoping that that's something that we can do throughout this semester as we read and as we watch film and documentaries. We can also queer, I like queer as a verb, right? We can queer normative knowledge, identities, and institutions. So queering is a way of thinking about sex and gender, right? And also just about knowledge itself and about institutions. If we are to queer Marquette, for instance, maybe we start to grapple with the assumed heterosexuality and whiteness as default positions at Marquette. Adrienne Rich also, this is one last thing that I'll point out. On pages 44 and 45, we kind of are getting the genesis of queer thought. And Adrienne Rich's compulsory heterosexuality is something that I find really helpful in helping us to think through queerness. But it's the idea that for women especially, right, there's this expected life course that one gets married and then has children, right? That is what the compulsory notion of heterosexuality is. And Rich wanted to challenge that. And in the process, opens up new ways of being in the world for women, but also, which is something that can be applied to all people, I think. Now, for our reading today and for our discussion post, I want us to think about what queer is, what are its different definitions and uses, and what does it mean, really, after you've done the reading, what does it mean to think queerly? And I want you to identify a passage or two that stand out to you and be ready, be ready to write about these in your discussion post. Remember that it's due Thursday at midnight, and don't forget to ask a question at the end of your post, something that doesn't require a yes or no, but that is open-ended, that will bring your classmates into the discussion. And also respond to at least one classmate. that is it for today. I will see you on Tuesday. Don't forget that for Tuesday's class, you will finish your reading from Queer Graphic History. So go ahead and finish the book and come ready to discuss. Maybe highlight two to three passages that stood out to you for whatever reason. Okay, that is all, and I will see you on Tuesday. Please reach out if you have any questions.